Today, the Department of Justice and the State Department are announcing a historic reward of $50 million for information leading to the arrest of Nicolás Maduro.
Date: January 3rd, 2026. Target: Nicolás Maduro. Location: Caracas, Venezuela. Objective: capture or kill. The orders came from the highest levels of the United States government. But the first step to remove Maduro from power didn't happen in the Venezuelan capital. In fact, it happened in Washington a year ago. On January 20th, 2025, Donald Trump signs an executive order that would change everything. An order that allowed criminal organizations and drug cartels to be classified as foreign terrorist organizations. And that opened the door that until then had been locked: the possibility of treating Maduro, his inner circle, and the factions that protected him the same way the United States treats international terrorist groups. That simple signature would be the beginning of the end, the legal trigger that would make possible the boldest operation ever carried out by the United States in South America. Today, you'll learn step by step how the United States entered Venezuela's capital and captured the country's most powerful man without casualties. What does the future hold for Nicolás Maduro, the Venezuelan leader in power for 13 years? And to understand how this escalation began, we need to go back to 1823. James Monroe, then President of the United States, in 1823 established the so-called Monroe Doctrine, which was nothing more than a direct warning to the European powers that the era of colonization and exploitation of the Americas was over, and that, from then on, any intervention by European countries in the Western Hemisphere would be considered a threat to the United States. There are plenty of real examples of how this doctrine was applied in practice. The purchase of Alaska from Russia, the intervention in the independence of Cuba and Panama are some of the more distant examples. But it was during the Cold War that the doctrine was frequently invoked to justify United States interventions. And what does this have to do with Venezuela? Everything. Because despite what many people think, the relationship between the two countries was completely different from what it is today. This is the president of Venezuela in 1963 at a meeting with John Kennedy at the White House. Very different from today. During the last century, the United States and Venezuela were not just partners, they were strong allies, with both countries having good political, military, and economic relations. Kennedy even called Venezuela America's best friend in South America. In this context, Washington soon began selling weapons to Caracas, while American energy companies extracted Venezuelan oil. But United States oil interests suffered losses when Venezuela nationalized its oil industry a few years later. Even so, the United States reaction was discreet. Venezuela was one of many developing nations that nationalized their resources at that time. And Caracas paid the American oil companies more than $1 billion in compensation. It was also in the interest of the United States to maintain good relations with an important member of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries oil cartel like Venezuela, and there were still the Soviets to worry about. President Ronald Reagan publicly praised Caracas as a democratic inspiration for the hemisphere at a time when he was fighting against communist movements in the region, rewarding the Venezuelan state by selling 24 F-16 fighter jets worth $1.75 billion in 1981. But the United States' interest in Latin America decreased after the fall of the Soviet Union. However, Venezuela was still essential for the Americans since the country had just surpassed Saudi Arabia as the main oil supplier to the United States. But in 1998, leftist revolutionary Hugo Chávez was elected president, promising major reforms, channeling popular anger against rampant corruption and the persistent poverty. Despite the country's vast oil resources, the United States reacted with caution, even with Bill Clinton receiving Chavez at the White House in 1999 in an attempt to maintain some kind of peaceful relationship. But everything changed in 2002. In April of that year, a coup attempt failed and Hugo Chavez returned to power, full of hatred and thirsty for anger and revenge against the United States. Even more so because declassified documents in 2004 revealed that American authorities had prior knowledge of the coup plan against him. In 2007, Chavez reaffirmed state control over Venezuela's oil industry, forcing foreign companies to accept minority stakes in new joint ventures. When ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips rejected the measures, Chávez seized their assets. His successor, Maduro, took over the country in 2013 as sanctions and punishments from the United States increased, and Venezuela found itself increasingly dependent on the main rivals of the Americans, including Russia, China, as well as Cuba and Iran. From then, Venezuela faced an unprecedented economic crisis, forcing millions into miserable conditions. Repression of the population, questionable elections, and authoritarianism grew like never before and became symbols of Maduro's government, until everything changed when Donald Trump took power for the second time in 2025. When Trump signed the executive order on January 20th, 2025, few outside national security circles realized its true impact. On television, it looked like just another anti-cartel measure, but behind the scenes, it changed the game. Because by labeling international criminal factions as foreign terrorist organizations, Trump put Maduro and the apparatus surrounding him under the same legal framework that allows the use of drones, special forces, and preemptive actions without declaring war. For Washington, this was inevitable. In the American discourse, Maduro was not just an authoritarian president who dragged the Venezuelan economy into collapse. Trump claimed he was the head of a narco-state responsible for 300,000 deaths per year in the United States. Because of the cocaine route that crosses the Caribbean, it was a powerful narrative, and internally, it justified every step. But there is always the other side. Venezuela had the largest oil reserves on the planet. For critics, that was the real red line. Not the cocaine, not the cartels, but the fact that China, Russia, and Iran were expanding their presence in the country, challenging the old Monroe Doctrine, which has governed United States foreign policy in the hemisphere since 1823. As we saw, from the first decree, the United States began a systematic process, a maritime campaign throughout 2025, which decimated several vessels and people accused of transporting drugs in international waters. On December 16, 2025, Trump announced what Reuters described as the most aggressive blockade against Venezuela since the Cold War. Any oil tanker entering or leaving the country could be intercepted, searched, and even detained. Nothing would get through without American authorization. For Washington, it was simple: cut off the regime's money and pressure Maduro to the limit until he surrendered. They wanted regime change. The United States, with its powerful naval arsenal and the world's largest aircraft carrier, was warning of what was to come, and the next step would be much more visible. Or almost, because before the United States reached Caracas, something strange happened and no one noticed at the time. In the early hours of January 3, 2026, 150 aircraft surged into Venezuelan airspace with one mission: to kidnap Nicolás Maduro. Minutes later, an entire part of the city plunged into darkness, with no power, no cell signal, no internet. For the population, it was just another Venezuelan blackout. For American intelligence, it was the exact moment. According to sources mentioned by Reuters, highly trained teams from the United States Special Forces carried out surgical strikes against military communication systems, the same ones that Maduro used to connect with generals and regional commanders. The goal was not to destroy Caracas, it was to isolate a single man, and it worked. Maduro realized the radio was silent when he tried to activate the chain of command. No one answered. When he tried to use escape routes, they found some were already compromised. So the most surprising thing wasn't that the Americans came in, it was the lack of resistance. Reports indicate that part of the presidential guard simply retreated, others disappeared. Some believed it was a Venezuelan operation, not a foreign one, and maybe that's why everything happened so quickly. Maduro didn't try to fight, didn't try to flee, didn't try to negotiate. He realized he had already lost before the first door blew open. But the most unbelievable part was still about to happen. How could they remove Maduro from Venezuela without interference? Capturing is easy, extracting is another story. According to reports published hours later, the United States created a temporary air corridor, disabling Venezuelan radars for a few minutes. Just enough for an unidentified aircraft to take off from Venezuelan territory and disappear before Caracas understood what was happening. Many were already celebrating. Many soldiers, without orders from above, remained paralyzed. Washington announced the capture almost immediately, calling Maduro the leader of a transnational criminal organization. Critics, however, claimed that this was not an operation against cartels. It was a power grab to redefine who controls the largest oil reserves on the planet. Both sides have strong narratives, and both narratives will shape the future of Venezuela. Pamela Bondi, the Attorney General of the United States, stated on X that Maduro was charged with conspiracy to commit narco-terrorism, conspiracy to import cocaine, and other conspiracies to possess destructive weapons against the United States. Trump said Maduro and his wife were flown by helicopter to a Caribbean warship, then headed to New York, where, according to the American Attorney General herself, they will face the full force of American justice on American soil in American courts. Maduro will probably have the same fate as Manuel Noriega, who ruled Panama from 1983 to 1989 when he was overthrown by a United States invasion. He spent 20 years in prison before being extradited and dying under house arrest in Panama in 2017. Venezuelans are left with the joy of freedom from a dictator and hope for a better future. And may its natural wealth generate prosperity, since its oil reserves are worth about $17 trillion, an amount greater than the gross domestic product of all the countries in the world combined, except for the United States and China.